بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما إلى علمنا. We took the last lesson, the hadith of Malik and Zayd ibn Aslam and Ata ibn Yasar أنه قال جاء رجل إلى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فسأله عن وقت صلاة الصبح فسكت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عنه حتى إذا كان من الغد صلى الصبح حين طلع الفجر ثم صلى الصبح من الغد بعد أن أسفر ثم قال أين السائل عن وقت الصلاة فقال ها أنا ذا يا رسول الله فقال ما بين هذين وقت. Does anybody have any fawaid that they can recall from that last narration?
صبر الصحابة على تعلم
صبر الصحابة على التعلم. نعم. كيف ذاك? How is that?
لأن he was waiting about 3 days, right, to get an answer from the Prophet.
Yes, because he didn't get his answer until, if he asked that night at Maghrib or Isha, and then the next day at Fajr, and then the following day at Fajr. So about 2 days before he got an answer from the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He didn't get frustrated or give up or walk away. I asked him 2 days ago, right? And in some of the narrations, it doesn't mention that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said anything to him. In some of the narrations, it doesn't mention that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said anything to him. فَسَكَتَ عَنْهُ. He just didn't respond to him. And it shows you that the Sahaba, they wouldn't let the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam not responding to them turn them away. They would think that they did something wrong. And you see that often in the Sahaba, that when they would ask the Messenger and the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam would not respond, they would think that they asked a bad question. And this is something that the student should keep in mind, that sometimes your teacher turns away from you. Sometimes he disregards your question. Sometimes he ignores you, right? Sometimes he doesn't answer the phone. Sometimes he doesn't, right? Don't take it as a criticism of your teacher, but take it as a patience in learning. Although in other narrations, it said that the Prophet ﷺ didn't respond to him directly and said, pray with us tomorrow. And so in that is the etiquette for the teacher, that he should comfort the heart of the questioner, right? Make him relax, make him know that it's okay what you ask, even though I'm not going to answer you right now, come back tomorrow. And it shows that we talked about the permissibility of delaying information until the time it is needed. You can delay information until the time it is needed, as long as you don't delay it past the time that it's needed. Anybody else?
This is a mursal hadith.
This is a mursal hadith. What's a mursal hadith?
Where it stops at the tabi.
La, it doesn't stop at the tabi.
It doesn't have a sahabi in it.
No, it does not have a sahabi in it. We mentioned something specifically about that. If you said it didn't have a sahabi in it, then it's authentic, because all the sahaba are the same.
We don't know if he narrated from a sahabi or another tabi.
So the easier way to say it is marfu'u tabi'i. It's what a tabi'i says the Prophet said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
What's mursal then?
A mursal is marfu' at-tabi'i. Marfu', when they talk about in the science of hadith, marfu' وسمي مرفوعا والمسند المرفوع أو ما قد وصل. What's the line before it? Al-marfu' is what is attributed to the Prophet. Anytime somebody says the Prophet said something, فهذا مرفوع, or did something or approved something, فهذا مرفوع. Or some of them say it's marfu' and musnad. It has to be marfu' with a connected chain, right? والمسند المرفوع أو ما قد وصل أو مع وقف وهو في هذا يكل وثالث الراه. No, I'm sorry, that's al-musnad. So al-marfu' is, I'm trying to remember the line. Anyway, al-marfu' is what is attributed to the Prophet, regardless if it has a connected chain or not. So anything that is raised to the level of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they call it marfu'. A mursal is when the person who did the raf is a tabi'i.
He says
a tabi'i attributed to the Prophet ﷺ. And a tabi'i doesn't have the connection to the Prophet ﷺ to attribute such a thing. So there is somebody missing.
So this can be a mursal.
It is mursal.
It is mursal.
It is mursal because Ata, he never met the Prophet ﷺ, right? And so we know Ata didn't meet the Prophet ﷺ, but who's missing?
We don't know.
We don't know.
But
And that's why it's da'if, right? Except with Malik and Abu Hanifa and those who had their view, they say it's sahih, right? But the point is, the first type of mursal, they call it mursal, is marfu'u tabi. It's when a tabi'i says, the Prophet said, right? You can't say it's the hadith that's missing a sahabi. Because if you say it's missing a sahabi, then it doesn't matter, right? So you got to say that which the tabi'i.
But if we just took this, we don't know if it's missing a sahabi.
Exactly. We don't know it's missing a sahabi. Maybe it's a sahabi, maybe it's not. And we mentioned that this hadith, that one that we did last week, was musnad. It was connected from the pathway of Anas. From the pathway of Anas.
So
It
it's
says
Anas.
رجل جاء رجل إلى رسول الله
Like, Atta ibn Yasar, was he around when that man came?
No.
And so it's still mursal, because he's telling us a story that he did not witness. If he had witnessed that story, then it would have been connected, right? But we don't call this tadlis. We don't call this tadlis because that man, that sahabi, or the Prophet ﷺ weren't from Atta's teachers. So we call it mursal. And then we talked about the other type that's important to know, which is al-mursal al-khafi. And this is the distinguishing. You have tadlis, when a person says that their teacher said, or should I say, when a person makes you think they heard it from their teacher, right? You all say Abdul Hakim said. All of you have met Abdul Hakim, have heard something from Abdul Hakim, but you tell somebody Abdul Hakim said, even though you didn't hear it directly from me, you heard it from somebody else. That is tadlis. But if you say Uthaymin said, or let's take somebody else, if you say Fawzan said, right? All of you are alive in the time of Fawzan. Have any of you all met Fawzan? Right? Not yet, inshallah. And everybody knows you haven't met Fawzan, right? Or anybody who knows you haven't met Fawzan yet, right? And so if you said Fawzan said, is that tadlis? Huh? Irsal khafi. Because you're saying something about somebody you could have met, but everybody knows you didn't meet him, but you're making it seem like you heard it from him. So that's irsal al-khafi. That's irsal al-khafi. And it's different than tadlis. It's different than tadlis. Anything else?
So this type is mursal al-sahabi or just?
No, this type that we just talked about is mursal. This type is just mursal.
Just mursal.
Right? And then you have mursal al-khafi. They use that, and especially amongst the tabi'een, right? Like az-Zuhri. Did Zuhri do tadlis or irsal? Zuhri would say something like he heard it from somebody. But we don't attribute tadlis to Zuhri, because the person he would say something like he heard it from them, when you study, you know that Zuhri never met those people, nor did he claim to have met those people. So that's just irsal. But the person who doesn't know, he would look at it and say, oh, Zuhri must have met this person because they were in the same time frame, and so Zuhri is doing tadlis. And tadlis is obviously worse than irsal khafi, right? Even though they're both not things that remove a person's reliability or righteousness with the majority. Then we said mursal al-sahaba was when a sahabi says something that he wasn't there for. And so it must be that he got it from another sahabi, and that doesn't matter. That has no effect. Like the hadith of Ibn Abbas, most of them are marasil. Right? How did Ibn Abbas get so many hadith? We know how he got so many. He would chase people down. He would sit on their porch to get a hadith from them. And then later on, when he would narrate it, he would just say the Prophet said. And a lot of times in their hadith, you can see, like, whose hadith was that? We just passed it in the hadith about when he says, I just got it from Fadl, like this Fadl used to narrate it. Go ask him about it, right? The point of it is that they would narrate on each other without mentioning each other. That's Mursal al-Sahabi. Anything else about this last hadith?
Is the Zayd ibn Aslam, is that Mawla Umar ibn al-Khattab?
No.
Abu Usama?
Abu Usama, no. He died year
137.
137?
That's what I got. No, 132. Wait, 136.
136 now. Yeah, 136.
He talks about you can't delay information. Like someone.
No, you can delay information to the time it's needed, but you can't delay information past the time it's needed. MashaAllah, antum tulab al-hadith.
But the Prophet ﷺ was free from the faults, because if you delay it, he could die. You don't know that, you know.
So you should not delay it.
Yeah.
That is true. Yeah. You should try not to delay it, but you can still delay it till the time it's needed, right? For example, and this is where hikmah comes into play. A person comes into the masjid and is wearing a bad shirt. New Muslim comes into the masjid wearing a bad shirt. He doesn't know salat. He doesn't know tawheed, barely, right? He doesn't know the details of the religion. Do I have to tell him right now to take that shirt off? Huh? Like, for example, he has something in it that would make his salat unacceptable if he prayed in it, right? Do I have to tell him the moment he walks into the masjid to take it off? Or can I educate him on wudu first, educate him on salat first, and then when it's time to pray, give him an alternative shirt or tell him to take the shirt off now because you have to pray? You see what I'm saying? Yeah. So there might be an example where you need to delay information to the time it's needed, whether it's because you're prioritizing other information over it or because wisdom necessitates that.
Or like he has a qaza or something.
Right, you see what I'm saying? So it depends on the circumstance, but there might come a time where you have to delay information until the time it's needed, even though you're not guaranteed to live. But you know who is guaranteed to remain? Who is guaranteed to remain? Allah. But from this creation, who is guaranteed to remain, and they won't stop being here.
From a creation?
Nuh? I'm about to say Nuh has gone. No, some group is guaranteed to remain, and they won't stop being here, victorious upon the truth.
I thought you meant like everybody.
So even if you died before you gave him the information, who's still going to be here? Al-Ta'ifatul Mansura. They're still going to be here, so he'll still be able to get that information. You see what I'm saying? So even though you might have delayed it until the moment it was needed, and you died before that, it's not like the person will lose the opportunity to get that information because the Ta'ifa will still be here. Ta'i, what about the meaning of the hadith? Any benefits from the meaning? We brushed over that part at the end.
Yeah,
nobody really got the fa'idah at the hadith. Hey, now.
Explain the four types of mashhur.
And I'm glad you brought that up because I remembered the word afterwards. Remember, I couldn't remember a word. The four types of, was it 4 or 5? It was 5. 5 types of people and their levels of being unknown. The first one was, we called him mubham. We don't know anything about him except a general description. A man, a tall person, somebody who used to be with Ibn Abbas, right? This is mubham. His complete identity is unknown. Then we have majhul al-ain. Who he is unknown. We know his name, but who he is as a person is unknown, and that's because he only has one student that narrates from him. Then the third type is what we call majhul al-hal zahiran wa batina. The one who his condition is unknown, outwardly and inwardly. And this is because he has 2 students, but nobody has spoken good or bad about him, right? And so he's unknown his condition, both outwardly. We don't know enough about him to make an independent judgment. He wasn't famous enough for us to see how good he was as a person, nor did anybody speak good of him. And then we have the last one, who is majhul al-hal, yani fil batin, who he is unknown, his condition inwardly. We might have some inclination about who he was as a person, but nobody spoke good about him, or bad for that matter, and so we don't know his condition inwardly. And then the last type of person that was unknown is al-muhmal. Al-muhmal. And al-muhmal is the one who they didn't specify who he is. They just said Muhammad said, and they left off his lineage or some identifying fact about him. And so if the person is muhmal and we don't know who he is, if the only person he can be confused with is another authentic person, then the hadith is authentic, inshallah. But if he can be confused with the inauthentic person, then the hadith is inauthentic. طيب. The last thing we talked about, and this is what I was wanting to get, is the disagreement about the salat of al-fajr. We talked about when does fajr start? When the true fajr enters. And this is by consensus, we said. إذا دخل الفجر الثاني أو الفجر الصادق أو الصديع, whatever they call it, when you can tell the difference between the khayt al-abyad min al-khayt al-aswad, this is by consensus the time that fajr starts. And it is when the light horizontally spreads across the horizon and is visible and recognizable. Then we said, when is the time that fajr ends? There are two opinions regarding this. Some of them say fajr ends when it becomes bright, even if the sun hasn't risen yet. And their evidence was the apparentness of this hadith from the statement of the Prophet ﷺ on the second day, or from the statement of Ata about the Prophet on the second day, ثم صلى من الغد بعد أن أسفر, and he prayed after it became bright. And so they say, and this is the opinion of the Malikiya, that that is the end of the time for Fajr. When it becomes bright, you cannot pray anymore. While the majority, they say that the time for Fajr ends when the sun rises. And their evidence, as we'll see soon, is the hadith of Abi Hurairah. Whoever catches man adraka rak'atan min as-subh qabla an tatlu'a ash-shams faqad adraka as-subh. And we'll talk about the disagreement more in that section. But we say that the stronger opinion is that Fajr ends when the sun begins to rise, meaning the moment any portion of the sun breaks the horizon, then that is the end of the time for Fajr.
Malikiya have that opinion?
The Malikiya also have that opinion as well.
No, I was saying that they have the hadith though.
A madhab often will have more than one opinion. And we said that, so the Malikiya, it is an opinion of theirs that it ends when brightness starts. Mm-hmm. But the Malikiya also have an opinion that it ends when the sun rises. And it shows the strength of that opinion that the Malikiya say that if a woman comes off of her period, and they call them ashab al-dururat, the people who had an excuse not to pray, and then that excuse leaves at a time when you have to pray, right? That's what they call ashab al-dururat, a person who was traveling and hadn't prayed yet, and then he makes it home. Ashab durura. A woman who was on her period and comes off. Sahiba durura. A person who was unconscious and regained sanity during this time. Ashab al-durura. So the Malikiya say that the person who was from the people of dururat, who had this excuse to not pray until that time, they can still pray, or they have to pray until the sun rises. And that shows us that that is the stronger opinion, that you have until sunrise. But they say just like Asr has a preferable time and a necessary time, then Fajr as well has a preferable time and a necessary time. And likewise, we're going to see regarding Isha. Isha has a preferable time as well as a necessary time. And even Maghrib has a preferable time and a necessary time, as we'll see, inshallah.
What is the understanding in those two hadith? It says when والصبح والنجوم
Badiyatun mushtabika. Did we get to that hadith yet? We didn't get there yet. But
I was
when
gonna ask, the stars, is it
no,
like the
when
stars?
nujum badiyatun mushtabika. We're going to talk about some of that today when we talk about the statement of متلفعات بمروطهن ما يعرفن من الغلس. We're going to talk some about that today, inshallah. But when nujumu badiya, yani you can see them. The stars are still out. And not only are they out, they're mushtabika. They're all intertwined. And that is something that is usually only in the depth of night, right? So there might be a moment when the sun starts to rise and the brightness comes and you can still make out a star here or there. Especially when you talk about like what we say, what they call in the West planets, right? When you see Venus, you can still see it in the daytime sometimes, or Mercury or things like this. But when are the stars interlocked? When you look up and you see that picture that all of us have in our head where it's just stars on stars. That's Badiya Mushtabika, right? And so he would say, pray Fajr when? In Del Ghalas, right? And there can only be Ghalas at that time. And we'll talk about that today. The last thing we talked about last week, which is going to fall over in today, and this is the reason why we wanted to bring it up in the review, is what is the best time to pray Fajr, right? There are two opinions. The people of Iraq, the people of Kufa, generally speaking, the people of Iraq, following the view of Ali ibn Abi Talib and Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, they say the best time to pray is when it is bright. Before the sun rises, but when it is bright, i.e. the later time of Fajr. They say the best time to pray is the later time of Fajr. And this is because the hadith of Rafi ibn Khadij, where he said that the Prophet ﷺ, he said, make Fajr when it's bright, because the more bright it is, the greater is your reward. Right? And they translate the word there, asfiru, make Fajr when it's bright, as when it's bright. The majority, however, from them, the Malikiyya, the Shafi'iyya, the Hanabila, the Zahiriyya, they all hold the opinion that you should pray Fajr when it is dark. And there are a lot of evidences for this from them. The hadith of Farwa, the best actions to Allah is the salat at the beginning of its time. And likewise, the hadith that we have in front of us today, the hadith of Amrah bint Abdul Rahman on Aisha radiyallahu ta'ala anha. طيب من يقول أو يقرأ لنا الحديث؟ من يقرأ الحديث؟ من يقرأ الحديث؟ تفضل.
هنا
أنت تفضل.
أحاول إن شاء الله. حدثنا أبو مسعود حدثنا أبو مصعب قال حدثنا مالك عن يزيد يحيى بن سعيد عن عمرة بنت عبد الرحمن عن عائشة زوج النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أنها قالت إن كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ليصلي الصبح فينصرف النساء متلفعات بمروطهن ما يعرفن من الغلس.
ممتاز. طيب قال مالك حدثنا يحيى ابن سعيد. Yahya is Abu Sa'id, Yahya ibn Sa'id ibn Qais ibn Amr al-Ansari al-Khazraji al-Najjari. Abu Sa'id, Yahya ibn Sa'id ibn Qais ibn Amr al-Ansari, specifically from al-Khazraj. We all know that the Ansar had how many groups? اثنين. الخزرج و الخزرج والأوس. الخزرج والأوس. And Yahya bin Sa'id was from al-Khazraj. And specifically from what tribe of al-Khazraj? Bani Najjar, al-Najjari. And Bani Najjar were the maternal uncles of the Prophet ﷺ, because his grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, his mother was from Bani Najjar. Hashim, he married a woman from Medina, and they had, Shaybatul Hamd, who was known as Abd al-Muttalib. And so the Prophet's maternal uncles were Bani Najjar. وَهُمْ خَيْرُ دِيَارِ الْأَنصَارِ. They were the best group of the Ansar. The best tribe of the Ansar were Bani Najjar. And so we see this common trait with the Prophet. And this is an important point. The Prophet ﷺ had the best lineage. The Prophet ﷺ had the best lineage from every aspect. Was his lineage the best because he was from them? Or was it the best lineage and that's why he was from them? You understand the question? Was his lineage the best because he was from them? Or was his lineage the best and that's why he was from them? Yes, it's absolutely the second one. They were better before the Prophet ﷺ. Because if that's not the case, then anybody that the Prophet ﷺ would have been from would have been the what? He would have been the best. If the Prophet was American, Americans would have been. But we know that Allah Azza wa Jal, He created the creation and broke them into two groups. And He preferred the children of Ismail over everyone else. And He preferred from the children of Ismail Kinana. And He preferred from Kinana Quraysh. And He preferred from Quraysh Hashim. And He preferred the Prophet ﷺ from Bani Hashim. But even on the Prophet's mother's, or should I say maternal side, on his father's side, you find Bani Najjar being the best of the Ansar. Qais, Yahya's grandfather, was a Sahabi. Qais ibn Amr ibn Sahal was a Sahabi. As far as Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Ansari, then he was born sometime before 70. He was born sometime before 70 during the Khilafah of Abdullah ibn Zubair. And Abdullah ibn Zubair, the Sahabi, the first child born in Medina, was one of the Khulafa who was entitled to it. He was the Khalifa. Sometimes you hear from those who like to talk in history and they like to tell you that Abdullah bin Zubair was doing khuruj and was revolting. The reality of it is that Abdullah ibn Zubair was the Khalifa. He was the Khalifa after Muawiyah ibn Yazid ibn Muawiyah renounced. There was some conflict in Mecca during the time of Yazid ibn Muawiyah. And during the time of Yazid ibn Muawiyah happened all of those events that saddened the Muslims, like the death of al-Hussein, and like the battle of al-Harra, where they entered into Medina and slaughtered many of the Sahaba and Tabi'een. And during that time, Abdullah ibn Zubair was in Mecca, and there was an attempt to try to do some things with him that led to some disagreement. And during that time is when, either then or later on, is when the Kaaba was destroyed with the catapult. It happened. But during that time, Yazid died, and his son Muawiyah said, I don't want to be the ruler, go find your own ruler. And so at that time, the people gave bay'ah 62. Like Muawiyah died, what, year 42? No, year 61. Muawiyah died, if I'm not mistaken, like year 61, 62. Yazid was only the Khalifa for a short period, maybe 2 years, 3 years. And then after that, Abdullah ibn Zubair became the Khalifa. All of the cities pledged obedience to him, even Sham, even Damascus, except a small group of Bani Umayyah. A small group of Bani Umayyah led by Marwan ibn al-Hakam did not pledge obedience, and that's where the fighting started. But who was in the right during that time? It was Abdullah ibn Zubair. And during this time, Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Ansari was born. Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Ansari was from the Tabi'een. It's said that he didn't hear from anybody other than Anas, i.e. we don't have any narrations from him, from Sahaba, other than Anas. As far as did he meet other Sahaba, then it's more likely. But being born so late, you can see how maybe a large number of the Sahaba he might have missed. He traveled with Anas and accompanied him to Ash-Sham. When Anas went to Ash-Sham, Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Ansari accompanied him there as well. A little bit about Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Ansari. From his qualities is that he was thiqatun, imamun, hafiz. And these terms, when you see the people of hadith using them, they usually reference something. So obviously thiqa, we know he was reliable. Imam, meaning what? You see somebody's an imam. What is that?
He's a leader.
But a leader, how? Like you just say somebody's the imam.
He's a leader in being strong and thick.
No. Fiqh.
Ah, thick.
When they say somebody is an imam, usually they're referring to them being an imam in Islamic law, like Imam Ahmed, Imam al-Shafi'i. So Yahya bin Sa'id was an imam. He was an imam. And he was also a hafiz. Right? When you hear this term hafiz, what's that representing?
Memorize the word.
Hadith.
An extreme scholar in hadith. So we see that he was somebody who was reliable. He was a scholar in Islamic law. He was a scholar in hadith.
He's happy.
He was hafiz. He was one that they used to nickname him Talmid al-Fuqaha al-Sab'ah. He was the student of the 7 fuqaha. We talked about last time the 7 scholars of Medina, right? He was their student. So he learned from Ibn al-Musayyib and and Ubaydullah and al-Qasim and Sulaiman and Salim, etc. He was known as the student of them. This is his bona fides in fiqh. As far as in hadith, then they used to equate him with az-Zuhri. They used to equate him with az-Zuhri. And we said az-Zuhri during his time was the emir of the people of hadith. He was their leader. And they used to equate Yahya ibn Sa'id with az-Zuhri. Instead, there was a group of them who would prefer Yahya over Zuhri. Like Sufyan al-Thawri used to prefer Yahya ibn Sa'id over az-Zuhri. And likewise, Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Qattan. Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Qattan was an individual from the Atba' al-Tabi'een. He was an individual from the Atba' al-Tabi'een, from the students of Shu'bah, who was very well known for Jarh and Ta'dil. Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Qattan. He died in the year 198. He used to prefer Yahya ibn Sa'id over az-Zuhri as well. He would prefer Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Ansari over az-Zuhri as well. Ali ibn al-Madini, and you should know Ali ibn al-Madini is one of the scholars of hadith from the teachers of Bukhari, who was known for how he categorized people. right? How he, when you ask the question, who's on what level, who is where, right? Ali ibn al-Madini was one of those people. He said there are 4 scholars who the hearts are comfortable with whatever they say. And he mentioned from them Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Ansari and Amr ibn Dinar. Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Ansari and the people of Medina, and Amr ibn Dinar of the people of Mecca, and Ayyub as-Sakhtiyani from the people of Basra, another tabi'i, and Mansur ibn Mu'tamar. Mansur ibn Mu'tamar from the people of Kufa. And all 4 of these are major imams of their time. And Sufyan ibn Uyayna, he used to say that the muhaddithun of Hijaz, the scholars of hadith in the Arabian Peninsula, were Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Ansari and Ibn Jurayj, and I can't, and Ibn Shihab az-Zuhri, and Yahya ibn Sa'id and Ibn Jurayj. All of them used to deliver hadith the way that they should be delivered. So the point of all of this is for us to just know a little bit about the value of Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Ansari. He was born sometime before 70, and he was from the major scholars of hadith, if not one of the majorest, if not the majorest scholar of his time. Right? Most of us are going to say Zuhri more, but as we mentioned, there were a lot of people who would prefer Yahya ibn Sa'id over az-Zuhri. Yahya ibn Sa'id was the governor of Medina for Bani Umayyah. He became the qadi, not the governor, the judge of the people of Medina. He became the judge of the people of Medina. And then after that, as life went on with him, he became poor. He became poor. And it was in this state that after Bani Abbas took over, the Khalifa Abu Ja'far al-Mansur sent the request for him to become the judge in a city known as al-Hashimiyya, which was the capital before they built Baghdad. So you see the value of Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Ansari. He was a judge for Bani Umayyah. And right back then, politics was a big thing. You were a judge for Bani Umayyah. Bani Umayyah has now been executed. They've been kicked out, and the government has been overthrown, and now there's a new government, Bani Abbas. And even with this new government, who did they send for to be the judge in the capital city? Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Ansari. Instead, Abu Ja'far, he issued a verdict that nobody should give fatwa in Medina except 3 people: Malik ibn Anas, Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Ansari, and Ubaydullah ibn Umar. So Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Ansari was a major scholar. He was a major scholar. And Imam Malik, he said, after he went to Iraq, he became rich. One of the narrations, not from Imam Malik, says that, this is a funny story. He says, when the letter came from Abu Ja'far for Yahya ibn Sa'id to go to Iraq, he said to him, Wallahi, I'm not leaving except that I know everything, right? I know it all. I got it. I know it all. I'm ready to go to Baghdad to be the judge. I know it all. He said when he got there, he wrote back to that individual, when I told you I left, I knew everything. And the first 2 people to come to dispute something with me, they've said something I've never heard before. So go ask Rabi'a, yani Abu ibn Rabi'a ibn Abdurrahman, Rabi'a al-Ra'i. Ask him about it, but don't tell him you're asking for me, right? So the funny part of the story is he thought he knew it all, but then he got there, and of course the people of Iraq had situations you never heard of before. And that's how our situation here is in America. Our scholars, may Allah preserve them, right? Ulama, thiqat, fudul, afadil. And you know they know this religion. And then here comes an American with a story that they've never heard of before, right? because we're like the new people of Kufa. We got all the strange stuff.
We the Kufa now.
We're the modern day Kufa.
Dang.
Wallahu musta'an. So after that, he said, I saw, like, the first thing that I saw when we were walking Yahya out of the city was a janazah. And the person kind of took a bad omen by it, right? This is you leaving the city and the first thing we see is a janazah. He said, maybe you're worried. The person said, there's no bad omens except the omens that Allah creates. He says, if what you think is true, my situation is going to be easy. He said, it wasn't 2 months later except that Yahya sent enough money home to pay all of his debts and take care of his family. And like this, Yahya ibn Sa'id remained a judge in al-Hashimiyya until he died in the year 143. He died in the year 143 after the Hijrah. There's a story about Yahya ibn Sa'id that's interesting, talking about his imamah in Islam, his leadership in Islam. And when we talk about fiqh, here we're talking about major fiqh or aqidah. They say that Yahya ibn Sa'id, when he would narrate hadith to us, it was as if he was shooting pearls at us. But when Rabi'a, Rabi'a al-Ra'i, the Imam of Malik, the Tabi, Rabi'a ibn Abi Abdurrahman, when Rabi'a would enter, he would be quiet as a sign of respect towards Rabi'a. He said one day, Yahya recited this ayah, and the ayah is, I did not memorize it, it's in Surah Al-Hujurat, where Allah Azza wa Jal, he says, وَمَا نُنَزِّلُ, where Allah Azza wa Jal, he says, وَإِن مِّن شَيْءٍ إِلَّا عِندَنَا خَزَائِنُهُ وَمَا نُنَزِّلُهُ إِلَّا بِقَدْرٍ مَعْلُومٍ. And there is nothing except that it is from our treasures, and we send it down with a well-known portion. There is nothing except that it is from our treasures, and we send it down with a well-known proportion. You understand it? There is nothing except that it is from our treasures. Allah says there is nothing except that it is from our treasures, and we send them down with well-known proportions. There was an individual from where? Where do you think this individual is going to be from?
Kufa.
From Iraq, right? There was an individual known as Hamal ibn Nubata al-Iraqi. He asked Yahya ibn Sa'id, what about magic? Is magic from the treasures that Allah has sent down? And so Yahya, he said to him, this is not a Muslim's question. And he ignored him, right? Another individual, Ubaydullah ibn Haritha, Ubaydullah ibn, I just want to double check the name, Ibn Abi Habiba, Ubaydullah ibn Abi Habiba, he said, Yahya ibn Sa'id is an imam of the Muslims. He doesn't answer these type of questions. And that's one of the points that we want to get from that. Yahya ibn Sa'id is an imam from the Muslims. He doesn't answer these type of questions. But come to me, I have your answer. He said to this individual, magic can only hurt with whose permission? Allah's. Do you disagree with that? The individual couldn't say anything. And so like this, he answered the question, is magic from the treasures that Allah sends down? It only has its effect with Allah's permission. The narrator of this event, Ubaydullah ibn Umar, he said, so when the guy asked that question, it was as if a mountain had dropped on us. How are we going to answer this? And this other Ubaydullah ibn Abi Habiba, it's like he removed the mountain for us. But the point is that the Imam Yahya ibn Sa'id, he didn't answer this type of question. And that's an etiquette that you can learn about how to wa'arif and al-jahili. طيب, who does Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Ansari narrate on? Amra bint Abdul Rahman. She is Abu Rijal, right? She had a son who was a major scholar known as Abu Rijal Muhammad ibn Abdul Rahman. So she was his mother. Her name was Amra bint Abdul Rahman ibn Sa'ad ibn Zurara. And some of them say Ibn As'ad ibn Zurara. Have you ever heard of Sa'd or As'ad ibn Zurara? You should have heard of them. They are two of the most noble Sahaba from the Ansar. As'ad ibn Zurara was the first Muslim from Medina. He was the first one to accept Islam from Medina. And his brother Sa'd was shortly after him. Sa'd and As'ad ibn Zurara. So Amra, she is Amra bint Abdul Rahman ibn Sa'd ibn Zurara. As'ad, he died before they were done building the Prophet's masjid. Right? He died before they were done building the Prophet's masjid, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But Sa'd, he lived and he had children. From his children were Abdul Rahman. And they say Abdul Rahman was a Sahabi as well. He met the Prophet as well. And from his children was Amra. And Amra and her sisters were all raised in the house of Aisha. Amra and her sisters were all raised in Aisha's house. And this is something that they used to do back then. Aisha, as we're going to see, was the most knowledgeable person, one of the most knowledgeable people of her time. You would give your children to the people of knowledge and benefit and let them raise them. The same way we have school nowadays, you would send your children to the knowledgeable, well-educated person so they can learn the adab and the knowledge and the manners of that person. They would put their children in other people's houses and let the other people who had these qualities have a hand in raising them. And so Amra was raised in the house of Aisha. She was raised in the house of Aisha. And she is from the most knowledgeable people about the hadith of Aisha. She is from the most knowledgeable people about the hadith of Aisha. So much so that Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, and we covered him, he was the first person to kind of make it a government mandate to start writing hadith. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz was the first ruler to make it a government mandate that hadith start being written down in books. Before that, during the time of the Prophet, writing hadith down were haram in the early stages of Islam. And then later on, the Prophet allowed it. But a lot of the Sahaba were still against it. And likewise, the earlier Tabi'een, they were against writing hadith also. But during the time of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, he commanded that hadith start to be written down in books. And from the first people that he commanded was the the judge of Medina at that time, Abu Bakr ibn Muhammad ibn al-Hazm. Abu Bakr ibn al-Hazm. And he was the nephew of Amr. And so he told him, Umar ibn Abdul Aziz told him to gather up all of the hadith, especially the hadith of Amr on Aisha, right? Just to show how knowledgeable she was about the hadith of Aisha. So she was from a noble lineage, from this noble group of Ansar. She was raised in the house of Aisha, and she was born somewhere between 20 and 30 Hijrah. She was born somewhere between 20, 30 Hijrah, because when she died, they say that she was 77 years old. And they disagree. Did she die in year 98? Or did she die in year 106? Or did she die in year, 108, other than that? But the point is that she was born somewhere between 20 and 30 Hijrah. And she died in the year somewhere between 98 and 106. Tabi'i. Min kibar al-Tabi'in, right? From the older levels of the Tabi'in. Just like Yahya, her hadith can be found in all 6 books. Yahya bin Sa'id al-Ansari, his hadith are in Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi. Likewise, Amra. There's really not too much more to say about Amra. I'm trying to think anything else about her. One thing we forgot to mention about Yahya ibn Sa'id, and this is like an encouragement. They say that Yahya ibn Sa'id, how many hadith do you think he memorized? Remember, we said he's like Zuhri. He's the imam. He's the head of the scholars of Medina, muhaddith, hafiz of the people of Medina, how many hadith do you think he memorized?
Maybe 10,000.
10,000?
2,000.
2,000 Zuhri, okay, 2,000. They say he memorized 300.
What?
His hadith were 300. And some of them say, yeah, Yazid ibn Harun, they said, no, he memorized. I asked him how many he memorized. He said 600, 700. Right, so they say that maybe the 300 were just the marfu'at. Right? The point of it is that, yes, we want to be of those who have an abundance of hadith. But this leadership in Islam is not something that is only by an abundance of numbers. It's by your understanding of what you have, as well as your application of it, as well as your understanding of the fiqh of the Sahaba and the Tabi'een. Because that's what gave him this prestige and this leadership. Even though the ahadith of him are few. And the Muwatta of Imam Malik, there are only 75 of his hadith. And some of those are marfu', some of those are mursal, munqati', balaghat, right? So not all of them even have a chain. But that's just something to think about, that, right, this imam, it's not always about abundance, right? The most abundant narrator of all time only narrated 5,374 hadith, right? Abu Hurairah. After that, we have Aisha. Amrah, she narrated on Aisha bint Abi Bakr Abdullah, right? So Abu Bakr's name is one that they disagree about. Some people say Abu Bakr's name was Abdullah. And as far as Atiq, which is what some others say, then this was a nickname of his, Atiq. But his real name was Abdullah. So she is Aisha bint Abi Bakr Abdullah. And Abu Bakr did not have a child named Bakr, right? That was just a nickname that is a kunya that is more of a nickname. And this is something the Arabs used to do. They would take kunyas so they wouldn't get nicknames. Because the history of a nickname is that it is something that is usually criticizable, right? And the Arab, you can always tell what generation a person is from by what they have more of. Are they more known by a nickname or a kunya? The Arab of old, they would be known by their kunya. As far as the later generations, you find people like Shamsuddin, Nuruddin, Taqiyuddin, they all have what? Nicknames. After nicknames started being an okay thing. But that's why they used to tell you, take a kunya before you get a nickname. Because the people of old who didn't have kunyas, they weren't famous by their kunya, what were they known as? Al-A'raj, Al-A'mash, right? Al-Aswad, right? They would get those nicknames. So take a kunya, even if you don't have children, take a kunya, right? Take a kunya. So Abu Bakr Abdullah ibn Abi Quhafa. Abi Quhafa, his name was Uthman. That was Abu Bakr's father, Ibn Amir. So she is Aisha bint Abi Bakr ibn Abi Quhafa Uthman ibn Amir at-Taymi. At-Taymi, from Bani Taym. And Taym was the son of Murrah. So her lineage meets up with the lineage of the Prophet ﷺ in Murrah. Murrah ibn Ka'b ibn Lu'ay ibn Ghalib ibn Fihr ibn Malik ibn Nadhr. And Nadhr was Quraysh. So Aisha is Qurayshiyya, without a doubt. And it shows us that Qusay is not Quraysh. If you don't know, Qusay is is Hashem's father. Ibn Hashim ibn Abd Manaf ibn Qusay is Hashem's grandfather. They disagree about who is Quraysh. Some of them say Qusay is Quraysh, but he's not. He's Quraysh al-Thani, because Aisha is from Quraysh, and she doesn't meet the Prophet until Murrah. Some of them say it's Fihr, and the stronger opinion is that Quraysh was an-Nadhr ibn Kinana. Anyway, Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, al-Mu'mineen. She was the mother of all of the believers, as Allah Azza wa Jal described her in the Quran. And Allah sent down much Quran about her and because of her. Allah sent down an abundance of Quran about her and because of her. And from that which is recited until the day of judgment is the fact that Allah freed her of any fault from above the seven skies. Allah freed her of any criticism that the people might attack her with from above the seven skies. Her kunya was Abdullah. Her kunya was Abdullah. And as we all know, she married the Prophet ﷺ, the contract, when she was 6 years old. So she was born probably around 8 years before Hijrah. 8 years before Hijrah. And 2 years before Hijrah, when she was 6 years old, the contract between her and the Prophet ﷺ was ratified. And that was because of a dream the Prophet saw. The Prophet ﷺ had a dream where he married Aisha. He told Abu Bakr about it. And Abu Bakr was like, how can you marry her when you're my brother? And the Prophet explained that we're not brothers in reality, just in religion. And the marriage contract was agreed upon. But he did not build a life with her until she had become an adult. At age 9, 1 year after the Hijrah, i.e. the first year of Hijrah, or others, they say after the battle of Badr in Shawwal, the second year of Hijrah. This is when Aisha began to build her life with the Prophet ﷺ. They say that she got pregnant by the Prophet ﷺ. From the things that I found interesting that you don't hear often is that they say that she got pregnant by the Prophet ﷺ, but delivered the child as a miscarriage. And the child was buried, radiyallahu anha wa an walidiha. And as we said, her kunya was Abdullah, even though she did not have any children. But from the things that she did in abundance was take in orphans and raise other peoples, as we mentioned about Amrah. Aisha radiyallahu ta'ala anha, they said that if you gathered the knowledge of all of the other wives of the Prophet ﷺ and all of the women of the Sahaba, it wouldn't equate to the knowledge of Aisha. Aisha, our mother radiyallahu ta'ala anha, was a genius. I don't remember who said it right now, but you can find it in Tahdhib al-Kamal. Our mother Aisha radiyallahu ta'ala anha was a genius. She was unequaled. There are so many things that we only know about them because of her. She was the one who had the information when nobody else had it. And she was one of the 7 Sahaba who narrated the most hadith. There were only 7 Sahaba who narrated over 1,000 hadith. And Aisha radiyallahu ta'ala anha was, I believe, number 3. So obviously the first one is Abu Hurairah. I believe the next one was Anas, who I think he had 2,220 or 23, somewhere in that number. And after him was Aisha. Aisha radiyallahu ta'ala anha, according to the Musnad of Baqi ibn Makhlad, she had 2,210 narrations. Al-Dhahabi rahimahullah ta'ala, he says, out of that, there are 179 agreed upon in Bukhari and Muslim, and like 50-something that Bukhari narrates alone, and like 60-something that Muslim narrates alone. The point is that Aisha was from the more knowledgeable of people in language, poetry, all the time, in hadith, in fiqh, in aqidah. This was our mother, radiyallahu ta'ala anha. She was the beloved of the Prophet, the person that the Prophet loved the most. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said about her preference, وَفَضْلُ عَائِشَةَ عَلَى سَائِرِ النَّاسِ كَفَضْلِ الثَّرِيدِ عَلى سَائِرِ الطَّعَامِ. And the greatness of Aisha, or the value of Aisha over the rest of the food, is like the value of a tharid, which is a particularly good Arab dish, over all other types of food. And the only argument there is who was better, Aisha or Khadijah. Outside of that, there's no argument about Aisha. Radiyallahu ta'ala anha. She died in the year 57 or 58. And most of them say 58 after the Hijrah in Medina. She died in Medina. And Abu Hurairah, radiyallahu ta'ala anha, he led the salat over her janazah. They say that she died in Shawwal or in Ramadan. So this was our mother Aisha, radiyallahu ta'ala anha. طيب. This isnad, it shows us a couple of things. And we'll talk about one of the things that this isnad showed us. حدثنا يحيى بن سعيد and عمرة and Yahya bin Sa'id and Amrah binti Abd al-Rahman and Aisha. And the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, إن كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يصلي الصبح فينصرف النساء متلفعات بمروطهن ما يعرفن من الغلس. This hadith shows us that a man can do what? This isnad, what does it show us? A man can do what? A man can learn and be taught by a woman. Right? A man can learn and be taught by a woman and vice versa. A woman can learn and be taught by a man. The Prophet ﷺ kana yukhassu nisa. He used to single out a day, I believe it was Yom al-Khamis, for the women where he would teach them. And likewise, we find that from the women, scholars in abundance. And from them was Amrah bint Abd al-Rahman. And Yahya ibn Sa'id didn't have any relationship to her. One thing that we often encourage people to do is that when you see these men narrating on women, right, look for the family relationship. Whether it was breastfeeding, whether it was that they were orphans that she raised, whether it was that they were freed slaves, right, whether they were married into it. Look for this familial relationship, because a lot of the times that is the case. Like Urwa, he was related to Aisha. That's why he was able to beat so many other men with getting the hadith from Aisha. Likewise, Al-Qasim ibn Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr. He's related to Aisha. So he's able to get so many hadith from her over everybody else. But Yahya ibn Sa'id was not related to Amrah. Nor was he an orphan that she raised, nor was he in her house, right? But he still learned from her. And this shows us that a couple of things. One, the woman's voice is not an awrah. The woman's voice is not an awrah. You might hear people disagreeing about this. A woman, is her voice awrah or not? And the stronger position is that a woman's voice is not part of her awrah. You can talk to a woman, and a woman can talk to you. Allah Azza wa Jalla says, وَإِذَا سَأَلْتُمُوهُنَّ فَاسْأَلُوهُنَّ مِنْ وَرَائِ حِجَابٍ. And if you ask them anything, then ask them from behind a veil. But that shows us that you could do what? You could ask them. You could talk to them. You could hear their voice, they could hear your voice. Allah likewise, he says, يا نساء النبي لستن كأحد من النساء إن اتقيتن فلا تخضعن بالقول. If you have taqwa, then don't beautify your voices. فيطمع الذي في قلبه مرض وقلن قولا معروفا. So that the one who has a sickness in his heart will take enjoyment, but instead say a good statement. This shows us that the women can do what? They can talk to men, but not in a flirtatious way. لا تكسر صوتها. She shouldn't break her voice and beautify her voice. Just talk, right? And what you say has to be what? وَقُلْنَا قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا. And say a good statement.
Would you mention that one time they would?
Yeah, some of them mentioned that the Sahabi put their finger in their mouth when they would talk, just to avoid their voices being beautified. But the point of it is that the woman's voice isn't an awrah. So you can hear from them and they can hear from you in affairs of religion and affairs of importance, as long as the etiquettes of Islam are preserved. from the etiquettes of Islam, وَكُلِّ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ يَغُضُّوا مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِمْ, and say to the believing men that they should lower their gaze. Likewise, Allah says about the woman, قُلِّ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ يَغُضُّوا مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِمْ, and He says about the women, وَقُلِّ الْمُؤْمِنَاتِ يَغْضُضْنَ مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِنْ, and say to the believing women that they should lower their gaze. This is something that often we find the women being deficient in. Right? All the men know, lower your gaze, brother, turn your head, brother, lower your gaze. But the women, how often do they not? They'll approach you face first, engage with you without any shyness or humility. The woman should lower their gaze. Likewise, from the etiquettes is a proper hijab, a proper covering for themselves. And if you can keep a separation between you and them as well, then this is good as well. Also from the etiquette, when we talk about learning, like when we say a separation, keeping them in a separate area from the men, right? They say that a lot of the mothers of the believers, they would give hadith from behind a curtain, from behind a curtain. Likewise, from the etiquette is to not touch each other, to not actually physically come into contact with the opposite sex. The Prophet ﷺ said that one of your heads be poked with the iron needle is better than him touching a woman who is not halal for him. This is in al-Tabarani. الطبراني في المعجم الكبير and it's إسناد الصحيح. لأن يطعن في رأس أحدكم بمخيط من حديد خير له من أن يمس امرأة لا تحل له. That one of you be struck or stabbed in the head with an iron needle is better for him than touching a woman who is not halal for him. So it is okay to learn from a woman and a man from a woman and a woman from a man, as long as the etiquettes of these things are observed. And from the things that the people make mistakes in is that they go overboard in thinking about mixing that which is not mixing. And we're going to see some of this in the hadith. They think that this education of a man to a woman or a woman to a man is impermissible mixing. And I'm not talking about what is done in schools, but I'm talking about when the rules of Islam are followed, then that is not considered mixing. For example, the Prophet's Masjid, ﷺ, they used to have a woman who was the khadima. She was the housekeeper or the cleaning lady in the masjid. Where would she end up at? The men's side and the women's side, right? Yes, we're going to talk about that later. I think we pushed that to later. But there would be a woman on the man's side and a man on the woman's side. It happened. Likewise, when the Prophet ﷺ saw spittle or snot on the qibla of the masjid, a woman, because a person might say, well, that servant lady, she was a servant, she was a slave, so she didn't have the same rules as the free woman. Right? We know slave women, they had different rules than free women. But when the Prophet saw snot on the qibla wall of the masjid, a woman from the Ansar came and scraped it off and put some perfume in its place. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Ma ahsanu hadha." How good is what this is? How good is this? So that woman walked all the way to the front of the masjid and did this. And they did not consider that to be mixing. Why? Because they were covered properly. They were those who had taqwa, and they followed the rules of Islam about how to interact. Some of the people, they go too far in this, and they say that it's okay for men and women to just be around each other all the time. And we have to know that from the things that are haram, from the etiquettes that need to be observed when learning from a woman, is that you not be alone with her. Right? The Prophet ﷺ, he said, لا يخلون رجل بامرأة إلا كان ثالثهما الشيطان. No man is alone with a woman except the third of them is shaitan. And nowadays we have a new environment. there is a new reality that we have. And this is the reality of online. Right? The reality of online is a reality. And can you be alone with a woman in this reality? The stronger opinion is no. You should not be alone with a woman, whether in real life, IRL, or in virtual reality. You should not be alone with a woman. Not personal DMs, not personal messages, right? Because this, and Allah knows best, could be considered from being alone with a woman, where the third of them is the shaitan. But some of them, they go too far and they say, well, the hadith of Ibn Umar, that the women and the men, he says that kunna wan nisa natawadda ala ahad an-nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam min ina'in wahid. Hadith sahih. He says that we and the women used to make wudu from one container during the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so they try to use that as a proof to say that no, men and women can freely mix. It's no problem. Huh? The scholars, they respond to this hadith in case anybody tries to give you this shubha. And the reason why we're mentioning these things now, because they're going to come up in the hadith so we don't have to repeat them later. The scholars, they respond to this with three responses. The first of them is not that they would do it at the same time. They would just do it from the same container. Meaning there would be a place to make wudu around the masjid. The men would make wudu. And then the water that was left over, the women would make wudu from that water. And this is meant to show that a man can use the leftover water of a woman and vice versa. Others, they say, no, what is meant by this is the married people and the relatives. They would all make wudu out at the same time from the same pitcher. Like the Prophet ﷺ and his wives, they would scoop at the same time to make wudu. So you and your sister can make wudu from the same tub at the same time. You and your mother, you and your wife, there's no harm in that. The other opinion, and this is always something that has to be considered, and we'll see it coming up in this hadith, is that it was before the ayat of hijab. And before hijab, there were rules that are no longer applicable after hijab. So before hijab, there was a more freedom in mixing, that after the ayat of hijab, it put it into that. And so a lot of times when you see something that seems like, well, how could the Muslims mix in this way? You have to understand it as being something before the revelation of hijab. But as far as the hadith is fairly clear and simple. Aisha, she says, radiyallahu ta'ala anha, in kana Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. In kana, when you see it in a hadith, it shows consistency. So this is showing us that whatever Aisha is about to mention, this is something that the Prophet ﷺ did constantly. Yeah, and it's just emphasis, right? Inna shows emphasis. So what she's saying, she's sure about. And she would know, right? Her home was right next to the masjid. She would know when the Prophet got up to pray, ﷺ, and when he left. She says, in kana Rasulullah. Indeed, the Prophet ﷺ consistently la yusalli subh. So whatever she's talking about, it shows us that he would do it constantly. And from here we get the evidence that praying in the early part of the morning is better than praying in the later part. Because the action of the Prophet ﷺ that was consistent is better than the action that was a one-off. Did the Prophet ever pray when it was bright? Did the Prophet ever pray when it was bright?
Yeah, he did.
Yeah, we heard it in the last hadith, right? Asfal. But consistently, what would be his habit? What Aisha is mentioning in this hadith, that the Prophet ﷺ, in kana Rasulullah ﷺ la yusalli subh. And as we said, this was the opinion of the majority. Now, the next thing he says, in kana Rasulullah ﷺ la yusalli subh. Salat al-subh, we talked about that previously. In kana Rasulullah ﷺ la yusalli subh. فَيَنْصَرِفُ النِّسَاء. So the woman would leave, i.e. after the prayer was over, the women would leave. This shows us that it is permissible for women to do what? Huh? To go to the masjid, even at nighttime. The women can go out to the masjid even at nighttime. Right? Some people, they dislike to let the women out for the masjid at nighttime. But for the women to get to the masjid for Fajr, they would have to do what? They would have to go out at night. And so it's okay for the woman, even in nighttime, to go to the masjid. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, "La yamna'u ima Allah masajid Allah." Don't forbid or don't prohibit the slaves of Allah, the female slaves of Allah, from the masajid of Allah. So a man should not forbid his wife from going to the masjid. And this statement, is it specific about salat, or does it enter into that the other activities that are done in the masjid? Does it enter into that Jumu'ah, the khutbah? Does it enter into that the halaqat, the circles of knowledge? If your wife wants to go to the masjid for the class, can you prohibit her and forbid her? Right? These are things that require insight. But the hadith, it says, "La yamna'u ima la tamna'u ima Allah masajid Allah." Don't stop the slaves of Allah, the female slaves of Allah, from the masajid of Allah. So even in the nighttime, if there is a salat at night, Isha, Fajr, they are still to be allowed to go. From the things that are famous on Aisha, from the hadith of Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Ansari, on the authority of Amra binti Abdul Rahman, is that Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, she said that if the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam knew what these women innovated, he'd have forbade them from going to the masjid. Huh? Inshallah?
I think it said that in the book. Mentioned that, I think.
Maybe it's hadith. It's in Sahih Muslim and other places. That if the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam knew what the women did after him, he would have forbade them from the masjid. So, which one is right? Do we stop the women from going, or are we not to stop the women from going?
Nah, you let them go.
You just let them go.
Let them go.
Bismillah. Huh?
There's no bid'ah in the masjid. They're not going to be affected by the bid'ah.
Well, this hadith is not talking about the bid'ah.
Oh, this one.
Yeah, when we say if he knew what they ahdatha, it's not talking about what they innovated from bid'ah. Right? It's not talking about what they innovated from bid'ah. So the question is, which one do we do? Do we do what the Prophet said, or do we do what Aisha said the Prophet would have done?
We do ijtihad.
No.
Do ijtihad?
No, we
Figure it
don't.
out on our own. We don't care about what the Prophet said or what Aisha said.
What the Prophet said, is said.
But this is Aisha saying the Prophet would have stopped them.
Inshallah.
Here, you have to understand, and this is where we talk about fiqh, how to put the things together. Aisha is telling us what the Prophet ﷺ would have did out of knowledge of what the women did. And so what were the women doing that Aisha said the Prophet ﷺ would have stopped them from coming? Dressing inappropriate. A woman is not allowed to go to the masjid if she cannot dress appropriately. She can be forbidden. Perfuming themselves. A woman is not allowed to go to the masjid if she has perfumed herself. She can be forbidden. If the woman doesn't follow the etiquette that is necessary for going to the masjid, then she can be forbidden from the masjid. And the Prophet ﷺ would have forbade her if she did that. How do we know the Prophet ﷺ would have forbade women, or men for that matter, from going to the masjid? How do we know that the Prophet would have forbade people who didn't follow the etiquette in the masjid from going to the masjid?
The Prophet ﷺ, when he sees something
Allah
wrong,
does not forget.
he used to stop.
Because the Prophet ﷺ forbade people from going to the masjid. Nobody comes into our masjid who has eaten from one of these filthy plants. Talking about garlic and onion. What did the Prophet do? Stop them from going to the masjid. Can you stop a man from going to the masjid? Yes, you can. When he doesn't follow the rules of the masjid. Can you come into the masjid after eating garlic and onion? The Prophet said, la. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, any woman who has put on bukhor tonight, don't go to Isha. Any woman who has fragranced herself, a woman, mashallah, she's preparing for the night, she's with her husband, she's making herself look good, making herself smell good for her husband. And so she's put on bukhor, she's burnt that smoke that will make her smell good. When the husband comes home, he'll be pleased with what he finds. Any woman who has put on bukhor, don't go to Isha. The Prophet did what? Forbade them. Any woman masatib fala yashhad salatana. Any woman who has touched perfume should not observe our salat. And so, even though Aisha is saying what the Prophet ﷺ would have done, it's showing us that she understands why the Prophet would have did it, because of what the women did after him. And that's why it's important to understand she wasn't trying to change the religion after him, or saying that the religion would have been changed, but it's okay now for them to do these things. No. If there is a circumstance that entitles the woman or the man or the child from being prohibited from going to the masjid, then it is upon the people in charge to prohibit them from going to the masjid. Right? And like this, we understand that sometimes, can the masjid kick somebody out? Yes. Imam Malik, what did he do to the innovator? فَأَمَرَ بِهِ فَأُخْرِجَ مِنَ الْمَسْجِدِ. The person who asked about al-istiwa, how is it? He said, it's istiwa is understood, and how is unknown. And iman in it is wajib. And to ask about it is innovation. And I don't see you being anything more than an innovator. For umira bihi for ukhrija min al-masjid. And so he gave the command, and the person was escorted out of the masjid. How can you kick the guy out of the masjid? We got to pray. He's a Muslim. You can't kick the Muslim out the masjid. The people in charge, if a person does not follow the etiquette of the masjid, then the people in charge, whether it be the administration of the masjid or the people in charge of their homes when their women want to leave, the people in charge have the right to prohibit people who do not follow the etiquette of the masjid. طيب, what is the etiquette of the woman in the masjid? We mentioned proper covering. We mentioned not touching perfume. We mentioned now. And because of the problem of the people nowadays, this is where the concept of putting the women in a separate place came from. Because during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the women were not placed in separate places. The men and the women would be in the same masjid. No barrier, no curtain, no door, no wall. They would all be in the same masjid. And the Prophet educated them, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The best rows of the men are the ones in the front. The best rows in the women are the ones in the back, meaning their rows started at the back door, right? The first row for the women is the furthest away. And then they get closer to the imam. The women learned that when the salat is over, get up and leave right away. Don't hang out. Don't talk on the sister side with your voices that can cause a fitna, even though we said it's not a awrah. Don't talk on your side. Hey girl, salam alaikum, kif halik. No, roll out. You see what I'm saying? This is the etiquette that the Prophet ﷺ taught the women. From the etiquette, i.e. was the dressing appropriately and the no perfume, but they didn't consider, from the etiquette, is that the Prophet ﷺ would try to keep the men and the women separate. He said in the hadith of Ibn Umar, I wish that we could make this door specifically for the women. So he wanted to appoint a door for the women that they could come into the masjid from. And Ibn Umar, he said he never entered that door again. Right? So these are from the etiquettes that the women should be taught. But because of the deficiency of the people is where the concept of the curtain, the wall, the separate area came from. even though this issue isn't one that was legislated. It was not legislated by the Prophet. It's what they call masalih al-mursala. And this is not an usul class, usul al-fiqh. But from the things that are disagreed, is it a proof or not, is al-masalih al-mursala. The benefits that Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not legislate. There are benefits that we know Allah and His Messenger considered in their legislation, and they legislated because of it. For example, salat. What's the benefit of salat? What's one of the benefits of salat? That's a reward. What's the benefit of it? Like, what does it do?
Prevents you from committing bad deeds.
Inna salat tanha an al-fahsha'i wal munkar. So we know that a benefit in salat is that it prohibits this. Like, then there are benefits that we know that Allah and His Messenger did not care about. There are benefits, they are beneficial, but we know Allah and His Messenger didn't want them. We did not care about them. Like what? What?
Curtain.
No. Alcohol, gambling. Is there a benefit?
Yeah.
There's a benefit. But we know Allah and His Messenger don't care about that benefit. That benefit is mulgha. It is disregarded. The benefit of salat preventing you from fahisha and indecency is mu'tabar. It's a recognized benefit. And then you have benefits that are disregarded. And then there are benefits that were never mentioned. They were not considered or disregarded. This is what they call masalih al-mursala. Unmentioned or unspecified benefits. The curtain, does it have a benefit? Did Allah command us to do that? Did Allah forbid us from that benefit? It's a benefit that is undefined. And so is it okay to use that benefit or not? Is it okay to consider that benefit when making a rule? This is what they call masalih al-mursala. I have a situation where there's women who want to come to the masjid, and the men aren't as good as the Sahaba. I want to put a barrier. Akhi, the Sahaba didn't have a barrier. What does that look like now?
Bid'ah.
It looks like bid'ah. Play. They did not have a barrier. You're going to put a barrier. The Prophet could have put a barrier.
It's true.
Right? But you want to put a barrier. You want me to do something the Prophet didn't do? They say this is masalih al-mursala. Akhi, there's a benefit there though. And this benefit is a good one. And the religion didn't tell us no about it, and it didn't tell us yes. Some of the scholars say this is a proof. Other scholars say, no, masalih al-mursala aren't considered. And at the end of the day, what is better than the curtain, and what is better, because we can go back and forth about this all day long. You put them in a room with the wall. How do they follow the imam? They can't see the imam. They can't hear the imam. Oh, nowadays we have microphones and TVs. Okay, microphones and TVs go out. What do? Right? They have the, like, you used to, there was an article that we read about how it leads to the woman feeling marginalized in Islam. You put them in a small corner of the building, right? Ostracized, isolated. Is that a benefit now? Is the benefit still there? If it makes the kuffar look at the Muslims as if we're debasing the woman and regulating them to the margins? Or is the benefit that's greater? Well, no mixing. What's better than all of that? Teaching the etiquette. The women and the men learning how to be in the masjid. Abu Bakr, when he came late to the salat, he entered from behind the women and ran to the row. Right? What position were the women in?
Was it ruku'?
It was ruku'. You see what I'm saying? Did he stop and take a gander? Did his concern even cross his mind? Ooh, look at all the women bending over. He just wanted to catch the salah. This is on his part because of his iman. The women, when they were in the masjid, how were they? Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, she tells us how the women were in the masjid. فَيَنْصَرِفُ النِّسَاء مُتَلَفِّعَاتٍ بِمُرُوطِهِنْ. The women would leave mutalaffi'. Al-talfi' or al-talfiq. I'm sorry, al-talfi' or al-talfif. Right? Both words mean the same thing. But here we have mutalaffi'at. Al-talfi' is to completely envelop. Al-ishtimal wal-ihtiwa wal-taghtiya. To completely envelop. Right? To wrap it completely around them. Right? بِمُرُوطِهِنَّ يعني al-mirt, the singular, the mirt is a garment, it's a cloth made of most likely wool, and it's a thick garment. Thick gives us the benefit that it doesn't do what? It doesn't describe what's under it through seeing through it, and it's also thick so it doesn't describe what's under it when you wrap up in it. Right, the thicker the garment, when you wrap it around yourself, it stops it from clinging to the body and describing the shape. So they had these thick garments that they would do what? يَتَلَفَّعْنَ. They would completely envelop themselves. What would they cover? Everything. Everything. And that's why they say this is like the abayat of nowadays. The abaya, and not the beautiful decorative, you know, I remember Sheikh Salih Suhaimi saying like about the niqab. We're not talking about the niqab that the women wear now with the little line in between and the eyes well up to make a goat look good. You put the niqab on a goat, you be like, mashallah, nice sister. But we're talking about covering in a modest way. And this is how the woman would observe the salat. يَتَلَفَّعْنَ بِمُرُوطِهِنَّ مُتَلَفِّعَاتٍ بِمُرُوطِهِنَّ. So much so, Aisha, she tells us in another narration how the women would cover with these murut. She says, يَرْحَمُ اللَّهُ الْمُهَاجِرَاتِ الْأُوَلِ. May Allah have mercy on the muhajirat al-uwal, the first ones, the first women, the muhajirat who were at the front of the line. When Allah sent down the ayat, وَلْيَضْرِبْنَ بِخُمُرِهِنَّ عَلَى جُيُوبِهِنَّ, and let them strike with their khimars over their juyub, over their bosoms, she said the woman, they took the thickest part of their murut. Right, the murut is already a thick garment. أَخَذَتْ أَكْثَفَ or أَكْنَفَ. They took the thickest part of their garment and they wrapped their faces up with them. So these women, they would cover the entirety of their body with these murut. And so this shows us the etiquette that the woman would observe in going to the masjid and how they would dress. And if women dress appropriately, the curtain, there's no more need for it. There's no more mandation of it, because you have the men practicing the Islamic etiquette and you have the women practicing the Islamic etiquette. And if somebody breaks that etiquette, what do? You invent a whole new wall. You kick them out, mashallah, you're too harsh. You invent a whole wall just for that person who has a little bit lacking taqwa. What do? You teach them. You teach them. And it becomes hard to disobey Allah when everybody else is doing it. That's why Allah legislates our worship as groups. It's hard to not fast when everybody else is fasting. It's hard to not pray when everybody else is praying. How could you not make Hajj if everybody else was doing it? Allah legislates community in our worship to make it easy on us. And that's why in the last days, holding on to the religion will be like holding on to a hot coal. Because of what reason? There's nobody there doing it with you. So thank Allah for your communities that have this unification upon Tawheed and Sunnah, and do whatever you can to preserve them. Because al-khilaf shar. Now you see why it's so important that we as Salafis not fight with each other. that we not try to kick each other out and run each other away, because we're all we had. وَلَا تُنَازِعُوا, and don't fight amongst yourself. فَتَفْشَلُوا فَيَذْهَبُ رِيحُكُمْ, and your strength will go. Anyway, so these women, they would come to the masjid mutalaffi'at, completely enveloped in their garments. مَا يُعْرَفْنَا مِنَ الْغَلَسِ, they would not be known, or they would not be recognized because of al-ghalas. And al-ghalas is a word, and there are other words that are similar. Al-ghalas is the darkness where a little bit of light starts to come into it. It's the darkness when there's a little bit of light that starts to come into it, right? If you're pitch black and then it starts to get a little bit blue in there, that is al-ghalas. And this was meant by the statement of Umar, وَالنُّجُومْ بَادِيَةٌ مُشْتَبِكَةٌ, because al-ghalas can only be from the night when it starts to go into day. The ghalas can only be from the night when it starts to go into day. There is another word called al-ghabash. Al-ghabash is the same thing, darkness mixed with light, but it can be from the day going into the night, and it can be from the night going into the day. As far as al-ghalas, then that can only be from the night going into the day. And so these women were not recognizable because of what? Because of, exactly, and this is what the point is. Some of them say that this is an evidence for the obligation of niqab or the lack thereof. And both arguments are a little bit of a stretch. Because the women, when they would pray, what would they not do? They would not wear niqab. Women, they don't pray in niqab. And whether this was before hijab or after hijab, right? There's no evidence to support it either way. But the Prophet, or should I say Aisha, she tells us in the hadith why the women weren't recognized. And it's not just because it was dark. It's because they were wrapped up and it was dark. فَمَا يُعْرَفْنَا مِنَ الْغَلَسِ, they would not be known or recognizable because of how dark it is. But it's not just the darkness alone that is obscuring their identity. It's also because it's dark and they are what? Wrapped up. Because if it was just dark and they were unwrapped, you would still be able to recognize them when you talk about a little bit of light entering into it. But the fact that they were wrapped up in dark clothing, thick, heavy, dark clothing, and it's dark outside, all of that obscures their identity. The last thing that we wanted to mention is فَمَا يُعْرَفْنَ مِنَ الْغَلَسِ. It shows us that the Prophet ﷺ would not be extremely long when he prayed. It shows us that the common characteristic of the Prophet ﷺ would not be extremely long when he prayed. Because when they were done praying, what was it? Al-ghalas. The isfar hadn't happened. The brightness still hadn't come. And so we understand, and then we're going to see it later in the hadith of Umar, بِسُورَتَيْنِ طَوِيلَتَيْنِ مِنَ الْمُفَصَّل, even though they're long surahs, they're still long from the mufassal, which are the shortest surahs. The Prophet would not be extremely long generally during Fajr. Would there be exceptions? Yes. But the women would leave and it still would be dark, which means he wasn't praying for excessive length of time. And like we said, as far as praying at night, then this was the better action. From the benefits, we'll stop with this, is that who was the first Khalifa to pray when it was bright? Ali? No. Khalifa. We know that the Prophet ﷺ prayed when it was what? Dark. And likewise, Abu Bakr and Umar. The first Khalifa, they say, to pray when it was light was Uthman. And this was because of Umar being assassinated. Right? Umar was assassinated. And so Uthman started to pray when it was light. And that shows us that the reason for praying when it was light was what? to avoid the fitna that could come from it. Right? Before that, the Muslims didn't think anybody would come and assassinate somebody. But now you got Umar being stabbed, and you got to remember, there's no lights. Ma yu'rafna. There's no fires burning. There's no torches in the masjid. Right? If it's not a full moon, it's still dark. Nujum, badiya, mushtabika. Anything could happen in that circumstance. He's walking through the rows, checking the people, khanjar. Right? And so Uthman decided let's wait till it gets a little bit brighter so we can see who's around. And this shows us the permissibility of taking precautions. And that these taking precautions are a primary objective in Islam, to the extent that they even push away the preferable time of prayer. So for example, have you ever wondered when you go to make Umrah, why the guards ain't praying? It's terrible. These guards don't even pray with the people. Right? They sit here at the door the whole time. Ain't nobody even praying. Why the guards ain't praying? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? No, it's a good thing. The guards aren't praying to do what? To make sure that nothing bad happens. Is it okay to delay the salat to make sure the safety of the Muslims is protected?
The Fard Salah.
The Fard, that's what we're talking about. Is it okay to delay the Fard Salat to make sure the safety of the Muslims is protected? Yes. Absolutely. Right? That what they're doing is not a light issue. Right? It's okay to put off some things that might be from the religion when there is a greater primary objective of the religion before that. And you don't have to look far to see that. Salat al-Khawf. What's one of the ways that they would pray it? They would take turns while they're delaying the salat with the congregation. Right? But no. Somebody needs to stay and face the enemy to the extent that they had to carry their weapons in salat. Right? وَخُذُوا أَسْلِحَتَكُمْ. Right? Don't put them down. It's obligatory to carry your weapon in salat. So the point of it is that the Muslims should be conscious of this and look at these examples of the Salaf. Right? Uthman delayed the salat past its preferable time for a benefit. Right? And like this, we talk about, I remember something that, Muslim fighter pilots. A Muslim fighter pilot. He might have to shave his beard. Because it's hard to wear the oxygen mask that will allow you to breathe in this jet with a beard. And if you don't have this oxygen mask, you will pass out in the air, and thus you will die. And if we don't have fighter pilots, we are at a disadvantage. Should a Muslim shave his beard to be a fighter pilot?
You have to shave it all the way.
Huh?
You have to shave it?
To whatever extent you have to shave it. You've done something that you shouldn't have did.
Right.
At least in my view.
Youngsters.
Huh?
Get the people that don't really grow a beard. You know, those people that don't grow beards?
Get the people who don't. Invent a mask that can cover the beard. All of these things are great and are what Muslims should do. But as of right now, you got Muslim fighter pilots. What do we tell them to do? Abandon this field? Akhi, it's haram. You got to shave your beard. I wouldn't do it. Honestly speaking, you should go and, go to the masjid and learn Sahih Bukhari and give up being a fighter pilot. Right? Maybe you can be a baker. You got to be a fighter pilot. This is what you hear the youth. They think that what they're saying is education. Well, do you need to be a fighter pilot? It's not necessary to be a fighter pilot. And so that lack of necessity means that you can't shave your beard, and so you should just go get a different job. But maybe if everybody goes and gets different jobs, we won't have what? We won't have fighter pilots. And if we don't have fighter pilots, what does that put the Muslims in? A disadvantage.
That's only temporary, like operation.
If you, the point, I'm not telling you to shave your beard. And I'm not saying go become a fighter pilot. I'm saying if you are in that situation, is this a primary objective that is more important than the growing of the beard in that circumstance? And this is what fiqh is. this is what most of us overlook. We know a general principle. I am not shaving my beard, and good news, I'm not going to be a fighter pilot, right? I got to lose too much other stuff before I can be a fighter pilot, right? So the point of it is that it doesn't apply to me. But to that Muslim that it does apply to, you have to have the fiqh before you start telling him what is halal and haram for him. And even more important than that, before you start judging him. When you see that brother come from this country and he's a fighter pilot and he has a shaven face, what's your first thought about him? Look at this Fasik. This Fasik shaving his beard so he could be a fighter pilot. When you gonna memorize Muwatta? Right? We think like this. When you gonna memorize something? When you gonna do something? And akhi, what he's doing is with a sincere intention and proper action, what he's doing is not less important than what we're doing. Right? Because we need Muslims protecting the Muslims in the sky. Anyway, we'll stop at that amount. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على عبده ورسوله نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.